I'm just going to talk a little bit on, well, I was given the title Perspectives on Social Justice, so nothing too small and narrow here. Could happily talk about this for the rest of the day, except we all want lunch, so I won't do that. So can I have the next slide, please? Also, first, just to clarify, my new role, which the hat I'm not wearing today, isn't to do with the agency, it's to do with the Commission. So it's the Scottish Commission on Social Security, the role of which is to scrutinise regulations and to report on whether the expectations in the Charter have been met. But I'm not here to talk about that today. We've only just started. We had one meeting, so there's not a lot I can say about what we're doing on that. We're not doing a whole lot yet, but we will be soon. So in terms of Inclusion Scotland, what we're here to do, what we do, we're a disabled people's organisation. What that means, and it's something which I would like to suggest to you is very important, is that we are an organisation led by disabled people ourselves. We are not one of the big charities that are led by non-disabled people. And one of the things I always saying quite a bit about, and I think you may have heard a bit about yesterday, is about the importance of lived experience. So we aim to kind of bring about positive changes to policy and practice so that we're fully included in all aspects of Scottish society as equal citizens. So yes, influencing decision makers is a key part of that, and that's about putting policymakers in touch with disabled people, putting them together, making them hear about lived experience so that they understand what works and what doesn't. Because frankly, if you don't live it, with the best will in the world, you're not always going to see it. And so then it's about, we realise, this is always positioning disabled people as outside of power. We quite like to be in the middle, if you don't mind. Thank you very much. So part of what we also do is to support disabled people to be actively involved in politics and to stand for election. Through the Access to Elected Office Fund, that enables disabled people to have a level playing field. It means extra costs when they're standing as candidates in elections. And of course, it's cross-party. The other thing, though, is about developing capacity, awareness, and engagement. One of the key things we do there is about running an internship programme funded by Scottish Government, who pay for a living wage, for 3-month internships for disabled people in public and third sector, and we support that, and we are funded to support that. So if that's something you might be interested in, grab me over the lunch break, because we might be able to support you to take a disabled person intern fully paid and supported for 3 months full-time post or 6 months part-time. So that's enough about the background. Next slide, please. I just want to say a little bit about what social justice looks like from the perspective of the disability world. I would say that there are 3 main ways in which we think about this. And of course, they all overlap, but they're slightly different. So the first one is independent living. Now, this is often conflated with living independently, and the two are not the same. They're not the same because living independently implies you don't need services, you fend for yourself, you do your own thing. That's not the point here. The point is that you don't need to do that because you have choice and control over the services that you get, and thus you have choice and control over how you live your own life, and you are able to have the same choice and control and freedoms as any other citizen. Human rights, obviously, is hugely important in the disability world, but I must say I find a lot of my time talking about equal humanity and making the case that disabled people are equal as human beings, as much as talking about the importance of us having human rights. And finally, and I'll say a bit more about this, you may or may not have come across before, something called the social model of disability, which sounds massively abstract and theoretical, and people always wonder why on earth it's so important. But the point of it is, it's about where the cause of disability lies. What cause, because depending on how you understand the cause, you're going to do different things about it to address it. So I'm going to start by saying a little bit about that, just quickly. Next slide, please. So this is a very brief introduction to, there are more models out there that you can shake a stick at. But the key ones, medical and individual model, says disability is caused by an impairment, and it's to do with things to do with the individual. It's you that is the issue as a disabled person. You're the problem, and it's about how you treat, cure, whatever, the person, so that they fit within the world and the environment that they exist in. Social model says, no, it's not the impairment. It's to do with the way society is organized, about attitudes, about environments that simply don't accommodate people who have impairments. So if you change the attitudes, the environment, and all the rest of it, then we can get on with our lives. We're fully included. We still have an impairment, but the impact of that isn't exclusion. Personal tragedy, charity, possibly my least favorite of the bunch. And you'll see this in things like charity advertising, children in need, comic reliefs coming up, and there's elements of that in there as well. It's about disability as a personal tragedy. Disabled people are awfully tragic, but we're also incredibly brave, and heroic, and awfully admirable. And there's a concept you may or may not have come across, but which I'd like to introduce you to if you haven't, known as inspiration porn, which basically means you look at the poor wee person who lives a terrible life, and it's all kind of soft focus, and there are violins going on, and you think, oh, but if I just give them some money, I'll just feel great. It's that warm, fuzzy feeling you get when actually what you're doing is unbelievably patronizing and very much distancing, and it's all about pity. It's not about empowerment, it's about pity. And that does so much damage to the way disabled people are viewed and how we get treated, and it puts back the quest for equal citizenship by a very long way. So, enough of the rant. Next, on to the next slide. How social barriers are preventing inclusion and hence social justice. Well, negative attitudes, and I'm going to say these take a lot of different forms. It isn't just, people getting bullied and sometimes even killed because they're a disabled person, and hate crime. That can certainly be part of it, but there's a lot more subtle stuff going on as well. The built environment, obviously, set of stairs, you can't get up them if you're in a wheelchair. Some of it's really obvious again, some of it isn't, because it could be about lighting, poor lighting, or the wrong kind of lighting, or all sorts of different issues. Environment is a very wide-ranging issue. Badly designed public transport speaks for itself. The way things are organized. So you go along to a meeting, you're a blind person, somebody tables a paper. Well, that's not exactly equal participation, is it? So there are things about maybe you need a bit of time to get up in the mornings because you need a PA to come and get you organized and help you get dressed and so on. That's not factored in. But the conference, the other side of the central belt, starts at 9 o'clock in the morning and you're first on. Stuff like that. The way things are organized can be really an issue. The way things are communicated. Well, it's great you're an employer who wants to employ disabled people, but actually, they're never going to find out about it because you haven't actually communicated it in ways to anybody who's going to understand it, because they're not accessible in the way you've communicated it. People aren't going to get it. So if they don't know that the job's there, they're never going to apply for it. And if the way that you're communicating what's required isn't accessible or actually inadvertently discriminatory, you're not going, you can brand yourself as accessible as you like. You're not, because communication barriers can get in the way. And it's also about imagery. So it's not just about the words or written documentation. It again goes back to this tragic victim thing. How do the imagery that goes alongside, conveying what who a disabled person is, and of course cost. Disabled people, we get extra, because of all this stuff, we tend to incur a lot of extra costs. But we also have reduced access to earned income because of the types of discrimination that I've explained when it comes to employment and employers. Next slide. Some general implications of it, if you look at the social model, is that disabled people are people with impairments. That doesn't change. And we're also not saying disabled people don't have medical conditions and don't need healthcare. But the point is, you're a person with an impairment who is disabled by social barriers, by attitudes, by inaccessible environments, by the way things are. That's what disables you. I'm disabled by those sorts of things, low expectations, etc., because not because I happen to be in a wheelchair. It's not the wheelchair that disables me, it's the attitudes. And so you can have quite a severe impairment, or very severe, but actually not experience disability and inequality, or vice versa. You sprain your ankle, place that works up a spiral staircase, no way of adjusting it. You're pretty disabled by that, actually. It's not the impairment that's done that, it's the way things are organized in the environment. And language, disabled people, or is it people with disabilities? We say disabled people because we are disabled by society. The disability isn't with us. And carer, it's sort of an emotive connection. I employ somebody, I have a duty of care to that person. So she provides me with assistance. And I also want to say there's no difference Doesn't matter who you are, what kind of status you have in your working life, how much you earn, or what your background is, you are going to come across social barriers every day if you have a visible impairment, and also if you don't, actually. And in a way, that's good. It keeps you grounded. You can't get too above yourself, because you're going to experience this nonsense all the time. So that's some general implications. The next slide, please. I'm going to give you a bit of a personal perspective. Now, of course, the thing about what you do every day of your life, you know as well, if not better than I do, what's happening to people out there. You know that human rights are not being met. You know about food banks, about really dire poverty, real distress, really difficult choices. You know, the UNCRPD, the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, you know, there have been examinations of that recently. You know, the committee says it's a human catastrophe. You know, the grave and systematic violations of disabled people's human rights. Response to the UK government has basically been, well, we don't agree, and I'm not sure we really care that much anyway. That's a bit of a paraphrase, but that's kind of it. So that's kind of, if you like, the bigger picture stuff. I'm going to just talk a little bit about my perspective. I don't always like to do this because sometimes as a disabled person, you feel a bit like Exhibit A, you know, being wheeled out as a specimen to be, you know, looked at and examined. But I do think it can be quite helpful, I hope, in just giving a bit of a sense of what it feels like to be on the receiving end of this sort of stuff all the time. So the things people have actually said to me include total stranger, woman on train, sat there just going off to work, meeting in Glasgow. I just want to say, I think you're very brave. Well, I'm just on a train going to work. I mean, yes, having to do a ScotRail, you have to have a certain degree of courage. But, you know, so misplaced. The one, this happens a lot. I'm so glad I met you, because until I did, I thought I had problems. Well, thank you very much, you know. Yeah, you know, some assumptions there about the quality of my life. The where does she want to go? Oh, this is so frequent. Sat there at a taxi rank, coming out of an airport, the people that organize, the drivers, the people organizing the taxis, don't ask me. They ask the guy who happens to be with me, you know, the assistance person from the airport, where does she want to go? You think, well, you know, my usual response, depending on how annoyed I'm feeling and how tolerant I'm feeling, usually not very tolerant, is along the lines of, well, maybe if you just asked her, she might be able to tell you. He doesn't know, he's only just met me. Anyway, so you get a lot of that, which sounds trivial in some ways, but it's actually really hurtful because it's denying your capacity. You're positioned as a child. You know, you spend a lot of your time, in my role, you know, I'm leading an organization. You know, you have to have authority, you have to have people's confidence, and then you get treated like that. So I'll come out with a meeting with a cabinet secretary, go out to the taxi rank, and I get that. You know, that contrast, that dissonance is really hard to deal with. Oops-a-daisy, oh, this is a classic. First day as a civil servant, going to speak to DWP. Well, not speak to them, actually work for DWP. I went over to the dark side temporarily. And, you know, driver got me out the taxi. As he did, he said, oh, oops-a-daisy, as he kind of bumped the chair along. So I said, why did you say that? Why did you say that? Oh, you just reminded me of my children. Oh, are they in wheelchairs as well then? Blush, blush, whatever. I then have to go from that into a lift, come out the other side, and lead a new division of people. Quite a challenge. And this one, the expression on my face, I think, explains my reaction. It will probably be reflected in your faces. If you run over my foot, I'll put you over my knee and spank you. Now that was, I won't say exactly where, a certain Scottish government building receptionist opening a door for me. Not the kind of thing you get as the average kind of person, or anybody, I suspect. You know, would they say that to somebody else? No, I don't think so. Anyway, next, I realize time is ticking, so I won't go on to this too long. This is just an example of some of the stuff. We've all done it. That email chain, you really didn't mean to send it on to that person, and oops, you did. This is one I got. The person who, to do with me going to a meeting, they told us it's accessible, I couldn't get in the lift. And basically, this email is a series of excuses. I didn't like losing the lift, apparently. Didn't like to. The wheelchair was bigger than usual. Somebody else said, didn't ask me, it isn't bigger than usual. Never had any issue before. I frankly don't believe that. Elevator, it would have been possible to get into it without turning to us. No, you couldn't. I tell you, I couldn't do it. It may cause discomfort. No, I couldn't get into the lift. It wasn't that I was uncomfortable about it or wasn't trying. I couldn't get in. And then, of course, an apology, not to me, but to the event organizers. This is how our experiences, in subtle ways, get discounted and minimized and dismissed. So next slide, please. And just a few examples of, this is a recent conference I went to, and it was on the theme of disability by an organization with the word disability in its title. I won't go into say whose. And I just had a catalogue by the end. I was there to speak on disability. So first thing, spot the obvious problem with the name tag. You have a visual impairment. Sally who? Yeah, minor issue. How am I going to operate that alarm cord? Short of pulling the grab rail off the wall. Next slide, please. You might be able to see here a flight of steps to go up onto the stage in a handheld mic. That's where everybody else was going. I had to go right round the back, up the side, different sort of way onto the stage, which distinguished me as being different. This is the view to what they called the green room. Some obvious blockages here. Next slide, please. And this is me at lunch. Stand-up buffet. No tables. I demanded a table. They went and got one from outside in the garden somewhere, brought it in. There's me sat in splendid isolation, whilst everybody totally ignored me, walked around me, and did all the networking that they could do that I couldn't participate in. So next slide. Now, I hope you're not feeling I'm terribly brave and tragic at this point. Don't you dare. So why do these things happen? Well, it's not deliberate. People don't think, right, we'll keep those pesky wheelchair users out. Let's build that really big flight of steps. Well, sometimes I think they do, but I don't think it is. And it could be really good intentions. Some of the worst things to deal with is people are really trying to do the right thing. They're trying to be caring. They get it wrong, and they end up being disempowering. But trying to sort of tackle that is like you just slap them around the face, because that was the best part of them. That was them as a nice person, as a kind, caring person. And you go around and say, stop patronizing me. It is a real shock. And it's very hard to manage that. I spend a lot of my time as a disabled person managing other people's reactions. I don't want to, but I just have to do it. Where exclusion is experienced, well, it's experienced from because things are not thought about at the start, which is why that conference happened in the way it did, because they didn't ask somebody with lived experience to go and do a little recce of it. As I said, if you live it, you see it. If you don't, you won't. Even if you're well-informed and so on, you won't see what the needs are, you won't see what the barriers are, and you won't see what works to remove them. And basically, it's about the importance of bridging social divides. In a situation where inequality, one of the things about inequality is that what happens is that different parts of society, different groups get further and further apart. So the thing you were talking about earlier, empathy, becomes even more difficult. I can't imagine what it must be like to be Boris Johnson. I can't say I spent a lot of time doing that, or that I necessarily want to, but by the same token, is he ever really going to understand what it's like to be me? The worlds are so different, and ever more fragmented in so many different, in different directions. Next slide, please. How can you stop? Well, it's about whose voices. In the disability world, it's about working with the organizations of disabled people, not the organizations for. In the equalities world, more generally, you wouldn't be going to an organization run by men to ask them to speak on what it's like for women, what women's lived experiences. Or you wouldn't go to an organization run by white people to find out what it's like, life experience as a black person. But in the disability world, it doesn't know how it works. Somehow there's this sort of expectation, or almost that people who are not disabled might do a rather better job of speaking for the poor dears and the poor dears themselves, thereby rendering the poor dears even less empowered and adding to that disempowerment. Co-production, this is a buzzword, but my God, it is really meaningful. And it is about how you work as equal partners with people from the outset. And when I say equal, it doesn't mean you're doing the same. It just means that you get the service providers, the policymakers, the end users, the deliverers, all around the table, and you look at whatever the issue is from all those perspectives. Which means, apart from the fact you're going to come out with something that's been tested from all of those who are going to have to play a role in delivering it, the process means that you start to understand each other so much better. Because the thing about these social divides, and the further apart we get, the way we do it is we stereotype. Stick a bunch of disability activists in the same room as a bunch of civil servants. There's a fair to middling chance that these civil servants will leave in tears because they've just been attacked. I've seen that, and that happened to somebody in my division. And I understand why, because the anger is justifiable. But actually, that particular official was a relatively junior researcher who was not responsible for the crimes of DWP. So we all stereotype. Deconstruction. Think about your services. Think about, in order to access your services and to deliver a service, think about the stages that people have to go through. How do they get in touch? You know, what are the attitudes? What are the barriers? How things are communicated? Do all that social barriers list. You just break it down into stages and think about where any of those barriers might come in. Because frankly, if they come in at all at any stage, your service isn't going to be accessible. So deconstructing and thinking it through, but again, involving the people with the lived experience in doing that, because they will see it more clearly than you. And information and communication, kind of your bread and butter really, is hugely important. That's part of joining up this divide. And joining up generally, I'm going to say a little bit about joining up, if I have a few more minutes, because I think, again, it's about joining up in different ways of different things. So next slide, please. Perspectives around lived experience. This is just a little example. The Social Security, Scottish Social Security Charter, which you may well be familiar with, it was recently approved by the Parliament unanimously. It was co-designed by people with lived experience, people with experience of using Social Security benefit recipients down south, well, benefits from down south, but people up here. The thing about this charter is not only did the Cabinet Secretary, and she said this publicly, not make any amendment to it whatsoever, unlike her usual habit of scrawling red lines through things that civil servants send her. You know, basically, as I say, it was approved by the Social Security Committee, it was approved by the Parliament. But there's an issue here, you know, the key thing here, charters, oh God, warm words, nice intentions, blah. This one, ministers have to report annually to Parliament on what they've done to meet expectations. Now that does give it a few more teeth. And the commission that I am chairing will be also has the role of, from time to time, as in like whenever we like, reporting on whether those expectations are being met. There are some big issues here around inclusive communication again, because you have the best charter in the world that is enforced, but if people don't know about it, it's not going to work. And key, the area thing we're looking at now, is around measuring, monitoring, and evaluation. Because at the moment, it's pretty high level. And if you're really going to hold ministers to account, and the agency as well, because a lot of the charter is about delivery, you need to have some specifics in there. And that's kind of what's happening now. Again, I believe involving people with lived experience in developing that framework. Next slide, please. This is just a bit of feedback from the experience of somebody who was involved in that process, a disabled person. And I think it was really powerful. This is obviously a public domain. I think it was on Twitter. It's been one of the greatest honors of my life to be included in the group who wrote it. Everyone in the group has experience of the current system. We've written something we are immensely proud of. Session after session, we'd see our words, fears, and hopes take form. I can point to bits in the charter which were my words. I will never be able to describe how important it is to us to be listened to and to be respected and believed. People came out crying because it was the first time for many of us that we'd been believed. I mean, that is, you know, shocking. But also, I think, hopefully spells out in words more powerful than I could convey just how important this is, just how meaningful it is, just how important this co-production, equal partnership is, both in terms of the process, but also in terms of what comes out at the end of it. Next slide, please. Here are a couple of my perspectives on human rights. I was off in Geneva a year or two ago where the UK government, States Party, was being examined on its performance. And here's a couple of photos they took. One, as you can see, is a lot of flags in a rather grand building. The other is what was happening inside that building. That is a dark corridor, lifts. Some workmen or persons had helpfully left a large sort of iron bar about a foot away from the lift, along with a load of mops and dustpans and bits and bobs, making it utterly inaccessible. And that's what struck me about this was, on the one hand, you have human rights, yeah, marvelous, international, terribly important, but it doesn't translate even within the same building down to the actual, what it takes to meet disabled people's human rights. So I couldn't get around because of this lift. Next slide, please. And this is one of my favorite quotes, most recent one. Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home. They're the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. So this is, again, going back to this theme I was talking about, perspectives, international, grand, marvelous, actual lived experience. The gap is enormous. Next slide, please. And here's a few perspectives on policy and delivery. How many of you have seen an action plan coming out of Scottish Government, and others as well, that actually isn't an action plan? I've seen quite a few in my time. And it's part of the issue is it's one where, again, it's the aspirations. We will halve the employment gap. Well, great. What, exactly how, who, when, where, action plan kind of needs that in it. The gap between national policy and local delivery. Now, I don't need to tell you about this. You do all this every day of your lives. But it doesn't always translate down. So you'll have this kind of sometimes very good processes now of developing policy and practice. Like I've said about in co-production and so on, Scottish Government does increasingly amount of that and is doing it increasingly well. And I really welcome that. It's fantastic. But you can have the best document, the best strategy, the best policy you like. If all it does is stay there on paper, doesn't actually touch people's lives, it's a waste of everybody's time. And then, of course, there are things that get in the way of that happening. It's around organizational cultures, inflexible systems. It can be about resistance to change and territorialism. It can also be, frankly, not enough cash, and that is very often at the root of a lot of it. And then there are also sometimes people don't know how you do it in practice. So you can talk about the social model to people, and they go, oh, yeah, I get that, or independent. But it's like, well, so what do we do? How do we do it? And if you don't kind of start working with people to spell that out, it just stays as a nice idea, and people carry on as before. Next slide, please. Nearly there. So I would like to say that when you're looking at perspectives of social justice, I refer you to my title, that we're looking at turning the whole thing on its head. Because where you start from, I think, is not international bodies and treaties. You start from people. Because if it doesn't work for people, it's not working. If it doesn't reach people, if it doesn't touch people's lives, it's not working. I was at an event the other day. Somebody gave a presentation on research on the inclusive economy. And it was a research about, they'd gone out and spoken to everybody. Had they spoken to people with lived experience? No, they hadn't. They had examples of good practice. It was, policy, different practitioners, they want to speak together. They want to work together. Well, how often have we heard that mantra? So, of course, I said, well, okay, but is that an example of good practice? Because what was the outcome? How did that touch people's lives? Oh, we don't know. Well, that's not good. I don't know if that's good practice. You don't know if it's good practice because you've got no idea the impact it's actually having on the people. So, yeah, that's a recent issue. So it goes, I think, people first. Then it's about local community organizations. Because that is where a lot of the stuff happens. Local community organizations on the ground, they are the vehicles through which all kinds of things get delivered. They deliver human rights, they deliver preventative healthcare services, they strengthen communities, they keep them healthy and individuals healthy in every sense of that word. Frontline service deliverers, how many of these people actually, though, are the driving force for policy, or even sometimes asked? Very rarely. Then it's about the sort of local authorities. You're working upwards. Then it's about national, and then it's about international. And if you don't have, I don't know if you can see, the carefully selected upside-down pyramid has different sections to it, and there's actually little gaps between them. And the problem is, I think, these different perspectives, these different levels, these different layers do not join up. It isn't only that they're in the wrong order, they don't join up. And that is basically it. You'll be pleased to hear, because I can see you're looking hungry if you are, and I'm hungry as well. So, final slide is about what does it look like from your perspective. And I would say, it is for you to answer, but I think where your role is so important is around the joining up some of those gaps. It is about, you know what's going on out there. You're meeting people every day who are having all kinds of experiences about the impact, the outcomes that happen when these things don't join up and when they're not put first. So you have, I think, a really important role in starting to build bridges across some of these divides. And what can you do about it? Well, you can do the thing of deconstructing your services and disability equality training. That's always going to be helpful. But I think what mostly you can do, obviously not about speaking for people, involving people where you can, but the primary thing is, it's about speaking truth to power. It's about being the messenger. And it's about, when you get shot, as you will, repeatedly, getting back up and doing it all again. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening.